Part 1. One lonely night. One broken mafia boss. One love that changed everything. The city was quiet that night, the kind of quiet that only comes after midnight, when even the streetlights seem tired. Rain tapped softly against the windows of a small 24-hour diner on the edge of downtown. Inside, only one table was occupied. A man sat alone in the corner booth, his dark coat still damp from the storm outside. His hands were wrapped tightly around a cup of coffee that had long gone cold. His eyes stared blankly at nothing, lost somewhere far away from this small, quiet diner. His name was Alexander Vane, though almost no one dared to say it out loud without a shiver of fear. To the outside world he was just another rich man in an expensive coat. But behind closed doors in the shadows of the city, everyone knew who he really was. He was the head of the Vane family, one of the most powerful and feared crime organizations in the entire country. Men who crossed him disappeared. Businesses that refused him closed within weeks. His name alone could silence a room full of grown men. But tonight, none of that power meant anything to him. Tonight, Alexander Vane was simply a man sitting alone in a diner at 2 a.m, drowning in memories he could not escape. Exactly 1 year ago tonight, his younger brother had been shot and killed in a rival family's ambush, an ambush Alexander blamed himself for completely. He had been the one who planned that meeting. He had been the one who insisted it was safe. And his brother had paid the price for his mistake. Since that night, Alexander had built higher walls around himself than ever before. He trusted no one. He let no one close. His empire had grown stronger, more feared than ever, but the man behind it had grown emptier with every passing month. Tonight, unable to sleep in his massive, silent penthouse, surrounded by guards who protected a life he barely wanted to live anymore, Alexander had told his driver to stop at this small diner instead of taking him home. He didn't know why. He simply couldn't face another night alone in that empty apartment, staring at the ceiling, hearing his brother's laughter echo through his memories. The bell above the diner door chimed softly, breaking the silence. Alexander barely looked up, assuming it was just another late-night customer. But then he heard her voice. "Sorry, we're about to close soon, but you're welcome to stay if you'd like," the voice said gently. Alexander looked up slowly, his tired eyes finally focusing on the young woman standing near his table. She wore a simple diner uniform, her hair pulled back into a loose ponytail, a small name tag pinned to her apron that read Sophie. She looked exhausted, the kind of tired that came from working long hours on your feet, yet there was something warm and genuine in the way she smiled at him, despite the late hour. "I'll be fine here," Alexander said quietly, his voice rough from disuse. Sophie nodded, glancing briefly at the empty coffee cup in front of him. "Would you like a refill? It's on the house. You look like you could use something warm." Alexander hesitated, unsure why this small act of kindness from a complete stranger felt so unfamiliar to him. He was used to people fearing him, respecting him, obeying him. He was not used to someone simply being kind to him without wanting anything in return. "Sure," he said finally. "Thank you." Sophie smiled again, refilling his cup carefully before turning to walk away. But something made Alexander speak again, breaking his own rule of staying silent and distant from strangers. "Rough night?" he asked quietly. Sophie paused, glancing back at him with a small, tired laugh. "You could say that. Double shift. My coworker called in sick, so I've been here since this morning." "That sounds exhausting," Alexander said, surprising himself with how easily the words came out. "It is," Sophie admitted honestly. "But someone has to pay the bills, right?" She smiled again, though Alexander could see the tiredness behind her eyes, the same kind of exhaustion he recognized deep within himself, though for very different reasons. For a moment, neither of them said anything else. Sophie glanced at the clock on the wall, realizing she still had cleaning to do before closing. "Well, let me know if you need anything else." She turned to walk away, but Alexander found himself speaking again, almost without meaning to. "Do you always work this late?" Sophie turned back, a bit surprised by the question, though she answered honestly. "More nights than I'd like to admit. But it pays better than the day shift, and I need every extra dollar I can get right now." Alexander studied her carefully, noticing the slight tension behind her tired smile, the kind of tension that came from someone carrying more weight on their shoulders than they let on. He recognized that look. He had seen it in the mirror every single day since his brother's death. "Is everything all right?" Alexander asked quietly, surprising even himself with the sincerity behind the question. Sophie hesitated, clearly unprepared for a stranger to notice, let alone care. "It's complicated," she admitted softly. "But I'll manage. I always do." Alexander nodded slowly, understanding more than she realized. Sometimes managing is the hardest part. Sophie looked at him for a long moment, something unspoken passing quietly between them. Two strangers, both carrying invisible weights, both exhausted from battles no one else could see. "Yeah," Sophie said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. "It really is." Neither of them knew it yet, but this quiet, rainy night, this small, unexpected conversation between a broken mafia boss and an exhausted young waitress, was about to become the beginning of something neither of them ever expected to find again. Something real. Something honest. Something that would slowly begin to heal two hearts that had both, in their own separate ways, completely forgotten what it felt like to hope. Part 2. One lonely night. One broken mafia boss. One love that changed everything. Sophie finished wiping down the counter, glancing occasionally at the quiet stranger still sitting in the corner booth. There was something about him that felt different from the usual late-night customers who wandered into the diner. He wasn't drunk. He wasn't loud. He simply sat there, wrapped in a kind of quiet sadness that Sophie recognized immediately, because she carried the very same weight inside her own chest. She didn't know his name yet. She didn't know that the man sitting quietly in her diner was one of the most powerful and feared men in the entire city. To her, he was simply a tired stranger who needed a warm cup of coffee and maybe, just maybe, a little bit of kindness on a cold, rainy night. "Long day?" Sophie asked again, walking back toward his table with a small towel in her hand. Alexander looked up slowly. "Long year," he admitted quietly, surprising himself with how easily the truth slipped out. Sophie tilted her head slightly, studying him carefully. "That bad, huh?" "Something like that," Alexander said, his voice low. Sophie sat down across from him without asking, something she never normally did with customers, but tonight felt different somehow. The diner was empty except for the two of them, and something about the quiet honesty in his voice made her want to stay a little longer. "I lost someone important to me too," Sophie said softly, her eyes drifting toward the rain-streaked window. "My mom. About 2 years ago now." Alexander's expression softened slightly. "I'm sorry." "Me too," Sophie said with a small, sad smile. "She used to work here actually. This diner. It was her dream to open this place herself, but she never got the chance before she passed." "So you took over," Alexander said quietly, understanding beginning to form behind his tired eyes. "Something like that," Sophie replied. "I'm just trying to keep her dream alive. Even if it means working double shifts and barely sleeping most nights." Alexander studied her carefully, something inside his chest shifting uncomfortably. He recognized this kind of quiet determination, the kind that came from carrying someone else's memory forward, even when the weight of it threatened to break you completely. "That's not easy," he said softly. "No," Sophie agreed. "But it's worth it." They sat together in comfortable silence for a moment, the soft sound of rain against the windows filling the empty space between them. Alexander found himself studying Sophie carefully, noticing the exhaustion behind her eyes, yet also the quiet strength she carried despite everything she had clearly been through. "What's your name?" Sophie asked suddenly, realizing she had been talking to a complete stranger for the past several minutes without even knowing his name. Alexander hesitated for a brief moment. In his world, his name carried weight, power, fear. But here, sitting in this small, quiet diner with this exhausted, kind stranger, he found himself wanting, just for tonight, to simply be an ordinary man. "Alexander," he said simply, leaving out his last name entirely. "Sophie," she replied, extending her hand toward him with a small, tired smile. Alexander took her hand gently, surprised by how warm and soft it felt against his own rough, calloused palm. For a brief moment, neither of them let go, both simply enjoying the quiet comfort of human connection after months, maybe even years, of feeling completely alone. "Well, Alexander," Sophie said, finally pulling her hand back gently, "it was nice meeting you even under these strange circumstances." "Likewise," Alexander replied, a small, unfamiliar warmth spreading through his chest. Sophie glanced at the clock again, noticing the time had slipped past 3 in the morning. "I should probably finish closing up. Early morning tomorrow." Alexander nodded, though something inside him didn't want this quiet, unexpected moment to end so quickly. "Of course. Thank you for the coffee, Sophie." "Anytime," she said, offering him one last tired smile before standing up and walking back toward the counter. Alexander watched her quietly for a moment longer before finally standing and making his way toward the door. Just as he reached for the handle, he paused, glancing back one final time. "Sophie," he said quietly. She looked up, surprised he had spoken again. Yeah. Take care of yourself, Alexander said softly, meaning every word. Sophie smiled gently, something warm flickering behind her tired eyes. You too, Alexander. He stepped outside into the cold night air, the rain slowly beginning to ease into a soft drizzle. His driver waited patiently by the car, opening the door quickly as Alexander approached. As the car pulled away from the small, quiet diner, Alexander found himself glancing back one final time, watching Sophie's small figure moving quietly behind the counter, finishing her long, exhausting shift alone. For the first time in over a year, Alexander Vane felt something unfamiliar stirring quietly inside his chest. Not the cold, calculated focus of business. Not the heavy weight of grief and guilt he had carried every single day since his brother's death. Something softer. Something warmer. Oh. He didn't understand it yet, this strange, unexpected feeling stirring quietly inside him after just one simple conversation with a tired, kind stranger. But deep down, Alexander knew one thing clearly. He wanted to see Sophie again. Part 3, One Lonely Night. One Broken Mafia Boss. One love that changed everything. 3 days passed, and Sophie found herself thinking about the quiet stranger from that rainy night more often than she wanted to admit. She didn't even know his last name, only that his eyes had carried a sadness so deep it seemed to match her own. She told herself it was nothing, just a strange late-night conversation between two tired strangers who would probably never see each other again. She was wrong. On the fourth evening, just as the dinner rush began to slow down, the small bell above the diner door chimed. Sophie glanced up from wiping down a table and felt her breath catch slightly in her throat. Alexander stood in the doorway, dressed in a dark coat, his expression far less tired than the night she had first met him. You came back, Sophie said, unable to hide the small smile spreading across her face. I did, Alexander replied simply, walking toward the same corner booth he had sat in before. Sophie followed him, grabbing a menu out of habit before realizing he probably didn't need one. Coffee again? Please, Alexander said, settling into the booth. As Sophie poured his coffee, she studied him carefully. He looked different tonight, less burdened somehow, though there was still a quiet heaviness behind his eyes that never seemed to fully disappear. Rough week? Sophie asked, setting the coffee pot down and sliding into the seat across from him, just like she had the first night. Better than most, Alexander admitted. How about you? Still surviving double shifts? Sophie laughed softly. Always. But at least tonight's a little quieter. They talked for nearly an hour that evening, the conversation flowing easily between them despite how little they truly knew about each other. Sophie told him more about her mother, about the dream of this small diner, about the struggles of trying to keep it running with barely enough money to cover the bills each month. Alexander listened carefully, offering small pieces of his own life in return, though he remained careful never to mention the true nature of his business, the danger that followed him everywhere he went. He returned again the following week. And the week after that. Slowly, without either of them fully realizing it, their quiet late-night conversations became something they both looked forward to, a small, comforting escape from the exhaustion and grief that filled the rest of their lives. One evening, nearly a month after their first meeting, Alexander arrived at the diner just as Sophie was closing up for the night. The streets outside were quiet, the city finally settling into its late-night calm. Long day? Alexander asked, watching Sophie lock the front door behind the last customer. You have no idea, Sophie sighed, rubbing her tired eyes. The oven broke again. Second time this month. I don't know how much longer I can keep patching things together. Alexander frowned slightly, concern flickering behind his usually guarded expression. How bad is it? Sophie hesitated, embarrassed to admit the truth to someone she had grown to care about, even if she still barely knew him. Bad enough that I might have to close early next month if I can't afford the repairs. Alexander studied her carefully, something protective stirring quietly inside his chest. In his world, problems like this were solved instantly, with enough money to make any inconvenience disappear entirely. But here, with Sophie, he hesitated, unsure of how she would react if he offered help so directly. Let me help, he said finally, his voice quiet but firm. Sophie shook her head immediately. Alexander, I can't ask you to do that. You're not asking, Alexander replied gently. I'm offering. Sophie hesitated, her pride battling quietly against the exhaustion of trying to fix everything alone for so long. I don't even really know you, she admitted softly. Not really. Not who you truly are outside of these late-night conversations. Alexander's expression grew serious, something heavier settling behind his dark eyes. "You're right," he said quietly. "There's a lot about me you don't know yet." Sophie studied him carefully, sensing the sudden shift in his tone. "Is it bad?" Alexander hesitated, the weight of his secret pressing heavily against his chest. He wanted, more than anything, to finally be honest with her, to let down the walls he had built so carefully around himself for years. But he also feared that the moment she learned the truth, she would run from him completely, terrified of the danger that followed him every single day. "It's complicated," he said finally, echoing the same words she had used to describe her own struggles weeks earlier. Sophie nodded slowly, understanding the weight behind his hesitation, even if she didn't yet know the full truth. "Maybe someday you'll tell me." "Maybe," Alexander agreed quietly, though deep down he wasn't sure if he was ready to risk losing the one genuine connection he had found in years. For now, he simply reached into his jacket, pulling out a folded check and sliding it gently across the counter toward her. "Please, Sophie. Let me help you keep your mother's dream alive." Sophie stared at the check, her hands trembling slightly as she picked it up, her eyes widening in shock at the amount written clearly across the paper. "Alexander, this is way too much." "It's exactly enough," Alexander said gently. "Please take it." Sophie hesitated for a long moment, tears building quietly in her eyes. Finally she nodded, her voice barely above a whisper. "Thank you." Alexander reached out, gently squeezing her hand in quiet reassurance. "You don't have to thank me, Sophie. Just promise me you'll keep fighting for this place. It clearly means everything to you." Sophie smiled through her tears, nodding slowly. "I promise." Neither of them realized it yet, but this small, quiet moment of kindness had just deepened the connection between them into something far more powerful, far more dangerous than either of them was fully prepared for. Because somewhere out in the shadows of the city, rival families were beginning to notice Alexander Vane's mysterious late-night visits to a small, quiet diner. And it wouldn't be long before Sophie's simple, quiet life became entangled in the dangerous world Alexander had tried so desperately to protect her from. Weeks passed, and the quiet late-night visits between Alexander and Sophie slowly turned into something neither of them could ignore anymore. What started as two strangers sharing a cup of coffee had grown into something deeper, something neither of them had expected to find again after so much loss and loneliness. Sophie had repaired the oven, kept the diner running, and slowly started saving a little extra money for the first time in years. But more than that, she found herself smiling more often, laughing more freely, feeling lighter than she had felt since her mother passed away. And every time she looked up to see Alexander walking through that diner door, her heart skipped just a little. Alexander felt the same shift inside himself. The heavy guilt he carried over his brother's death hadn't disappeared completely, but it no longer consumed every waking moment the way it once had. Sophie's warmth, her honesty, her quiet strength, had slowly begun to fill the empty spaces inside him that he thought would remain hollow forever. One evening, after the diner had closed and the streets outside had grown quiet, Alexander walked Sophie to her small apartment above a nearby bakery, something that had become a comfortable routine between them over the past few weeks. "Thank you for walking me home again," Sophie said, smiling softly as they reached her door. "Any time," Alexander replied, meaning it completely. Sophie hesitated at her door, glancing up at him carefully. "Alexander, can I ask you something?" "Of course," he said gently. "What do you actually do?" Sophie asked carefully. "You never talk about your work. Ever." Alexander's expression grew serious, the familiar heaviness returning behind his dark eyes. He had known this question would come eventually, had feared it every single day since their first meeting. But standing here now, looking into Sophie's honest, trusting eyes, he realized he could no longer keep hiding the truth from her. "Sophie," he said slowly, "there's something important I need to tell you." Sophie's smile faded slightly, sensing the sudden shift in his tone. "Okay," she said carefully. "I'm listening." Alexander took a deep breath, steadying himself before finally speaking the truth he had avoided for weeks. "My family, we're not exactly known for legal business." Sophie frowned slightly, confusion crossing her face. "What do you mean?" "I mean," Alexander said carefully, "that the Vane family isn't just wealthy from normal business deals. We're involved in things far more dangerous than that." Sophie's eyes widened slightly, pieces slowly beginning to click together in her mind. "Wait, as in, the Vane family everyone talks about? The one people are afraid of?" Alexander nodded slowly, watching carefully for her reaction. "Yes." Sophie took a small step back, her mind racing. You're part of organized crime?" "I run it," Alexander admitted quietly. The entire family. I have for years. Sophie stood frozen, staring at him in stunned silence. Everything she thought she knew about this quiet, gentle man suddenly felt like it was crumbling apart in front of her. Why didn't you tell me sooner? She asked, her voice trembling slightly. Because I was afraid, Alexander admitted honestly. Afraid that the moment you knew the truth you would run from me completely. And I couldn't bear the thought of losing the only genuine connection I've found in years. Sophie's mind raced, trying to process everything she had just learned. She thought about every quiet conversation they had shared, every moment of comfort and connection, wondering now if any of it had been real at all. Is that why you gave me that money? She asked carefully. Guilt money? Because you felt sorry for me? No, Alexander said firmly, stepping closer. I gave you that money because I care about you, Sophie. Genuinely. Everything between us has been real. My feelings for you are real. Sophie studied his face carefully, searching for any sign of dishonesty, but found only quiet, desperate sincerity staring back at her. This is a lot, Alexander, she admitted softly, tears building in her eyes. I know, he said gently. And I understand if you need time. Or if you decide you can't be part of this world at all. Sophie hesitated, her heart pounding heavily in her chest as she weighed the danger of everything Alexander had just revealed against the genuine connection they had built together over the past few weeks. I need time, she finally admitted quietly. Alexander nodded, though the disappointment was clear behind his eyes. I understand. He turned to leave, but Sophie's voice stopped him gently. Alexander? He turned back, hope flickering quietly behind his tired eyes. Yes. Thank you for finally telling me the truth, Sophie said softly. Even if it's complicated, even if it's dangerous, I'd rather know the real you than continue living a comfortable lie. Alexander felt something warm settle quietly inside his chest, despite the uncertainty of the moment. Take all the time you need, Sophie. I'll be here. As Alexander walked away into the quiet night, Sophie stood alone at her door, staring after him, her mind and heart caught in a dangerous, uncertain battle neither of them could yet predict the outcome of. Little did either of them know, their entire world was about to change forever, as the shadows Alexander had tried so desperately to keep hidden slowly began creeping closer toward the fragile happiness they had both finally begun to find. 3 days passed since Alexander revealed the truth about his life, and Sophie hadn't seen him once. The diner felt strangely quiet without his familiar visits, though Sophie told herself it was better this way. Safer. Simpler. She had built a peaceful, ordinary life for herself, one focused entirely on keeping her mother's dream alive. She couldn't risk losing everything by getting involved with a man whose world was built on danger and violence. At least that's what she kept telling herself. But no matter how many times she repeated those words in her mind, she couldn't shake the memory of Alexander's honest, vulnerable eyes the night he confessed the truth to her. She couldn't forget the quiet warmth in his voice, the genuine care behind every word he had ever spoken to her. On the 4th evening, just as Sophie prepared to close the diner alone, the small bell above the door chimed unexpectedly. She looked up, expecting to see Alexander standing there. Instead, 3 unfamiliar men stepped inside, their expressions cold and serious. We're closed, Sophie said carefully, sensing immediately that something wasn't right. The tallest man ignored her, glancing around the empty diner slowly. You're the girl Alexander Vane has been visiting. Sophie's heart pounded nervously in her chest. I don't know what you're talking about. The man smiled coldly, stepping closer. Don't play games with us. We know exactly who you are. Sophie backed away slowly, reaching quietly for her phone hidden behind the counter. Please just leave. We will, the man said calmly, once you deliver a message to your boyfriend. Tell Alexander Vane that the Petrov family isn't finished with him yet. Tell him we know his weaknesses now. Before Sophie could respond, the men turned and walked out just as quickly as they had entered, leaving her standing alone in the empty diner, her entire body trembling with fear. With shaking hands, Sophie immediately called the only number she still had saved from weeks earlier. Alexander picked up almost instantly. Sophie? His voice was calm but immediately alert, as though he already sensed something was wrong. Alexander, Sophie said, her voice shaking. Some men just came into the diner. They knew about us. They said something about the Petrov family. Alexander's tone shifted instantly, sharp and serious. Stay exactly where you are. Lock the doors. I'm coming right now. 15 minutes later, Alexander arrived at the diner, his expression tense with worry as he found Sophie sitting quietly behind the locked counter, still shaken from the encounter. "Are you hurt?" he asked immediately, kneeling in front of her. "No," Sophie said softly. "Just scared." Alexander gently took her hands into his own, his jaw tightening with anger and guilt. "I'm so sorry, Sophie. This is exactly what I was afraid of." "Who are the Petrovs?" Sophie asked carefully. "A rival family," Alexander explained quietly. "They've been trying to challenge my family's territory for months. If they know about you, they'll use me against you," Sophie finished, understanding dawning slowly. Alexander nodded grimly. "I should never have let this happen. I should have stayed away from you completely." "Don't say that," Sophie said firmly, surprising even herself with the certainty in her voice. "I don't regret getting to know you, Alexander. Not even now." Alexander studied her carefully, something deep and emotional flickering behind his tired eyes. "Sophie, I need to protect you. Which means I need to increase security around you whether you're comfortable with it or not." Sophie hesitated, the weight of everything settling heavily over her. "This is really happening, isn't it? I'm really part of this dangerous world now." "Yes," Alexander admitted honestly. "And I will do everything in my power to keep you safe. But I need you to trust me completely." Sophie looked into his eyes, searching for any hesitation, any doubt. She found none. Only fierce, protective determination. "I trust you," she said quietly, though fear still lingered heavily in her chest. Over the following days, Alexander assigned quiet, careful security around the diner and Sophie's apartment, though he made sure it remained as unobtrusive as possible, careful not to disrupt the normal rhythm of her life more than necessary. Sophie slowly adjusted to this new, dangerous reality, though every unfamiliar face that walked through the diner door now made her heart race nervously. One evening, nearly 2 weeks after the threat from the Petrov family, Alexander arrived at the diner earlier than usual, his expression unusually tense. "We caught one of Petrov's men tonight," he said quietly, sitting across from Sophie in their usual booth. He was watching the diner. Sophie's breath caught nervously. "What happens now?" "I need to end this permanently," Alexander said, his voice steady but heavy with the weight of what he meant. "Before they escalate things further and put you in even greater danger." Sophie reached across the table, gently placing her hand over his. "Alexander, please be careful. Whatever you're planning." Alexander looked at her, something soft and grateful passing behind his usually guarded expression. "I promise you, Sophie, I will end this the right way. Because I refuse to lose you now, not after everything we've found together." Sophie nodded slowly, though worry still lingered heavily inside her chest. She had fallen deeply for a man whose world was filled with danger she never could have imagined. Yet somehow, despite every warning sign, she couldn't bring herself to walk away. Because for the first time since her mother's death, Sophie finally felt like she belonged somewhere again, dangerous or not. And she was determined to fight for it no matter what came next. The following week passed in tense silence. Alexander had grown quieter, more focused, spending most of his time locked away in meetings Sophie was never allowed to attend. She understood why, but the waiting, the not knowing, felt almost unbearable. Every night she closed the diner alone, she wondered if this would be the night everything finally fell apart. On a cold Thursday evening, Alexander arrived at the diner looking exhausted but strangely calm, a heaviness lifted slightly from his shoulders that hadn't been there in weeks. "It's done," he said quietly, sitting across from Sophie in their familiar corner booth. Sophie's heart pounded nervously. "What do you mean done?" "The Petrov family has agreed to a truce," Alexander explained carefully. "It wasn't easy. There were negotiations, concessions, things I won't bore you with. But it's over, Sophie. They won't be coming after either of us anymore." Sophie let out a long, shaky breath, relief flooding through her entire body. "Really? It's really over?" "Really," Alexander confirmed, reaching across the table to take her hands gently in his. "You're safe now. Completely safe." Tears welled up in Sophie's eyes, weeks of quiet fear finally beginning to release their grip on her chest. "I was so scared, Alexander. Not just for myself. For you too." "I know," Alexander said softly. "And I'm sorry I ever put you in that position. But I promise you, from this moment forward, I will do everything in my power to keep you protected and happy." Sophie studied his face carefully, noticing something different behind his eyes now, something lighter than the heavy grief and guilt he had carried the very first night they met. "You seem different," she said softly. "Lighter, somehow." Alexander nodded slowly, considering her words carefully. "I think, for the first time since my brother died, I finally feel like I have something worth truly fighting for." Something worth protecting beyond just power or fear. Me? Sophie asked quietly, though she already knew the answer. You, Alexander confirmed, his voice full of quiet certainty. You gave me a reason to hope again, Sophie. A reason to believe that maybe, despite everything I've done, everything I am, I still deserve something good in my life. Sophie felt tears slipping gently down her cheeks, though this time they were tears of happiness rather than fear. You deserve so much more than you probably believe, Alexander. Alexander reached out, gently wiping the tears from her cheeks, his touch soft and careful. I want to build a real life with you, Sophie. Not just quiet, late-night conversations in this diner. A real life together. Sophie's heart swelled with emotion, overwhelmed by the sincerity in his voice. I want that too, she whispered. More than anything. Alexander smiled gently, the kind of genuine, unguarded smile Sophie had only seen a few precious times since they had met. He leaned forward slowly, giving her every opportunity to pull away if she wished. When she didn't, he pressed his lips softly against hers, a tender, hopeful kiss that spoke more clearly than any words ever could. When they finally pulled apart, Alexander rested his forehead gently against hers, both of them breathing slightly unsteady in the quiet, comfortable silence between them. Thank you, Alexander whispered, for seeing something worth saving in me even after everything. Thank you, Sophie whispered back, for reminding me that hope isn't something you have to earn. Sometimes it just finds you on a quiet, rainy night, in the most unexpected place. Months passed and slowly, carefully Alexander and Sophie built a life together neither of them had ever imagined possible. The diner flourished, no longer struggling under the weight of broken equipment and unpaid bills, thanks in part to Alexander's quiet support, but mostly because Sophie's warmth and dedication had finally begun attracting a loyal community of regulars who cherished the small, cozy diner as much as she did. Alexander, too, had changed. He remained powerful, still respected and feared throughout the underworld, but something inside him had softened permanently. He no longer carried the same crushing guilt over his brother's death, understanding now that his brother would have wanted him to find happiness again, rather than punishing himself endlessly for a tragedy that was never entirely his fault alone. One quiet evening, nearly a year after that first rainy night in the diner, Alexander returned to the same corner booth where everything had begun. Sophie smiled as she noticed him, walking over with a familiar cup of coffee already prepared exactly the way he liked it. Long day? She asked warmly, sliding into the seat across from him, just like she had done so many times before. Long year, Alexander replied gently, echoing his very first words to her from so long ago, though this time, his voice carried none of the heaviness it once had. Sophie smiled softly, reaching across the table to take his hand. But a good one? Alexander looked at her, at the small, warm diner that had become his true home, at the woman who had somehow managed to heal a heart he believed had been broken beyond repair. The best one, he said quietly, meaning every single word. Outside, rain began falling softly once again against the diner's windows, echoing the very same storm that had first brought them together nearly a year ago. But tonight, the rain felt different somehow, gentle and calm rather than heavy and sorrowful, much like the quiet, unexpected love that had grown steadily between two broken souls who had finally, against every possible odd, found exactly what they needed in each other. One lonely night had brought them together. One broken mafia boss had finally found peace. And one unexpected love had changed absolutely everything.